Good morning to you all. Welcome to Penn Vicarage on this Wednesday morning. Lovely to see you. Hope you're well and cheerful. And as I always say, thank you so much for being with us, continuing towards the back end now of our adventure through a remarkable book of Genesis. And today, my friends, we're in chapter 47 out of 50. To remind you that Joseph and his brothers have been reconciled, and now his father Jacob, or is now known as Israel, has arrived in Egypt at the invitation of Pharaoh. And and having met Joseph in yesterday's reading in chapter 46, today he meets the Pharaoh, the man himself. So without further ado, Genesis chapter 47. So Joseph went and told Pharaoh, "My father and my brothers, with their flocks and herds and all they possess, have come in from the land of Canaan, and they are now in the land of Goshen." From among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, as our ancestors were." They said to Pharaoh, "We've come here to reside as aliens in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flock, because the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now we ask you, let your servants settle in the land of Goshen." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know that there are capable men among them, put them in charge of my livestock." Joseph brought in his father Jacob and presented him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the years of your life?" Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my earthly sojourn are 130. Few and hard have been the years of my life. They do not compare with the years of the life of my ancestors during their long sojourn." Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Joseph settled his father and his brothers and granted them a holding in the land of Egypt, in the best part of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had instructed. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food according to the number of their dependents. Now there was no food in the land, for the famine was very severe. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they brought. And Joseph brought the money to Pharaoh's house. When the money from the land of Egypt and from the land of Canaan was spent, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give me your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock, if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. That year he supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock. When that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said, "We cannot hide from the Lord that our money is all spent, and the herds of cattle are my Lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my Lord but our bodies and our lands. Shall we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We with our land will become slaves to Pharaoh. Just give us seed that we may live and may not die, and the land may not become desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe upon them, and the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made slaves of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of priests did he not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh, and lived on an allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Now I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Here is seed for you, sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves, and for your households, and as food for your little ones." They said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my Lord. We're slaves to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day, that Pharaoh should have the 5th. The land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the region of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it, and were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, 147 years. At the time of Israel's death drew near. He called his son Joseph and said to him, "If I found favor with you, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal loyally and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt. When I lie down with my ancestors, carry me out of Egypt and bury me in the burial place." He answered, "I will do as you said." And he said, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, again, high drama as always. It's fascinating, isn't it? Jacob has arrived in Egypt, and he's met Joseph yesterday's reading, and now's the time for him to meet Pharaoh, and he sends five of the sons in first, just in case. You kind of get, there's a certain amount of timidity here. And then there's, of course, this fascinating meeting of, as I say, of Jacob and Pharaoh. And imagine Jacob meeting the leader of a superpower, because effectively that's what Egypt was. And it's brilliant because Pharaoh is welcoming and everything else, and all looks tickety-boo, which is great. But I suppose what I think is really interesting here is that, bearing in mind, Pharaoh is in the powerful position because he's got the food, and ultimately Joseph works for him. He's got power because he's got power on the face of it. And Jacob and his sons have come because there was no food back in Canaan. So in a sense, they're the weaker party, if you like. And yet they have this meeting, and yet at the end, it's Jacob that blesses Pharaoh. I think it's fascinating that Pharaoh must have been so impressed with Joseph, and must have been so impressed by the kind of spiritual authority or gravitas maybe that Jacob has, that he allows Jacob to bless him. Because on the face of it, it should have been the other way around if you think about it. It's fascinating, but notice here that Pharaoh is blessed by Jacob. So I do think that there's something here about recognizing the spiritual power that Joseph has, and he got it from his father and from God, and that Pharaoh recognizes that. So I think the first notable point in this is that, despite the fact that Jacob's the one that's come in a weaker position, despite that, he's the one that blesses Pharaoh and not the other way around. I think the second thing I want to say is, and at this point I'm going to get fairly controversial really, the people of Egypt and the people around are all in a desperate state. The famine is clearly seriously bad. They're kind of 2 years in and people are starving, and it's really bad. And what Joseph does, because he's obviously got food because God told him through Pharaoh's dreams and so on. I mean, Joseph plays a blinder here, is that the people come and they're absolutely desperate. So he basically says to them, give us your livestock and I'll give you food. So they surrender their source of income and he gives them food. So they live in the short term and don't die. But on the other hand, actually they're surrendering their source of income so that when the famine is over, they're on the back foot. And when all that's run out, they become slaves. And I do wonder if, we don't, and I'm speculating what happened. My concern is that it was a good short-term measure because it saved their lives, which ultimately, of course, is right. But long-term, these people have lost their source of income, which then Pharaoh has it all, so it becomes state, plus the state, if you like. And also, of course, they become slaves. They become the property of the state too, and that they're not their own personalities anymore. Now, I noticed that in Jesus Christ, of course, we are set free. Jesus frees us from slavery, frees us from sin, frees us from death. But I'm concerned here that what Joseph does, which is a great measure in the short term, it saves people's lives, of course, and that's what you're meant to see. But the long term, they become slaves, and I do wonder if that could be setting the scene for the resentment which we get at the beginning of the book of Exodus, which we'll look at next week. So I just want to point that out, that he comes to a great deal on the face of it, but long term I've got concerns that he might have been storing himself trouble for the future. Finally, notice that it's towards the end of Jacob, or Israel, it becomes known as life, and at 147 he becomes a very ill man. And he says at the end that he tells Joseph to promise not to bury him in Egypt, because ultimately, even though he's in Egypt, actually his real hope, his real home, if you like, is in Canaan. His real home is the promised land, the hope of glory, if you like. His real home is back in Canaan, in the promised land. The land has been promised. And okay, he's happy to, live out the rest of his days in Egypt, especially as there's a famine going on. Quite right too, who wouldn't? But he says, bury me back in Canaan, bury me back in the promised land. Jacob, for all his many faults, he was a very flawed character in lots of ways, never forgot that his real home actually is in the promised land. And that's where his home and his real hopes and dreams are. And for us, my friends, our home is really in heaven. And we should never be completely comfortable in this world, because actually heaven is our home, and our home is with God, and that's our eventual destination. That's our real home. And as long as we're still here, if you like, we've never actually made it quite there yet. So, as I say, 3 things from this reading. Firstly, that Jacob arrives in Egypt, and despite the fact that he's the one without the food and Pharaoh is the food, notice that it's him that blesses Pharaoh and not the other way around. That's really. Secondly, I'm concerned about Joseph's deal here with the people, giving them food in the short term, making them live, which of course is right. On the other, long term, making them slaves and losing their sense of income. I'm concerned about that. And finally, that Jacob, for all his many faults, actually never forgets that he wants to go, that his real home is in the promised land. You know something, so's ours. Bless you, my friends. Thank you for watching. Enjoy your Wednesday. Have a lovely day. Do share your messages with these messages